When it comes to sugar versus vegetable seed oils, which is worse?
Seed oils are tremendously worse. It's like you're rusting inside. Nature doesn't make bad fats. Factories do.
How long do seed oils actually stay in the body?
About 2 years.
Dr. Knobbe is a world-leading eye surgeon, professor, and an expert in metabolic health.
With over 20 years of experience, he is showing new science on the connection between vegetable seed oils and chronic disease.
How do these omega-6 seed oils cause inflammation?
When you heat omega-6, linoleic acid, essentially, and it breaks down, it's kind of like smoking a cigarette. They are collectively cytotoxic, carcinogenic, obesogenic, and diabetogenic. They really couldn't get worse. That right there can account for a lot of the risk of all of the chronic diseases, everything from coronary heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes.
How are people consuming these seed oils?
So many people will say, well, I'm not putting any vegetable oil in my food. You don't need to get 80 grams a day, to get a third of your diet from vegetable oils, you won't even know it's there. Any processed food that has an added fat, it's going to be a vegetable oil.
So Dr. Knobbe, what is the fat that you eat every day?
The only fat that we add to our foods is butter. I don't use olive oil. I don't actually even use coconut oil.
Okay, let's go through the fats and the oils, the best and the worst of the worst.
Okay, the worst of the worst list would be...
This episode features Dr. Knobbe, and we're talking about the number one toxin in our food supply, and it is hidden in every single one of our foods. And it might be worse than sugar. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button, because we know that real food is medicine. And by the simple act of subscribing, you can help share the message to millions more people that need to hear the truth. And now for the episode with Dr. Knobbe. Dr. Knobbe, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on, Rena. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you.
Now, we are in a health crisis. The rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, obesity have skyrocketed. And the big question is, what is causing this? And there is a very dangerous oil that is available everywhere in our food supply that is slowly destroying our cells without us even knowing it. That is vegetable seed oils. So today, Dr. Knobbe is going to share his research and scientific evidence. There is 53 slides available with scientific research on this very topic. We're going to talk about what are the dangers in vegetable seed oils, how long they actually stay in your body, and why you need to eat butter instead. So Dr. Knobbe, my first question. I have an article here from Harvard Health. It says, no need to avoid healthy omega-6 fats, vegetable oils. They are heart healthy. So do you think that vegetable oils are heart healthy?
Yes, I know they say that they're heart healthy. And I've started some presentations by telling the audience that the Harvard School of Public Health, Mayo Clinic, the American Heart Association, many other major institutions known for their high caliber in nutrition, supposedly, promote and espouse vegetable oils, seed oils, as healthy and heart healthy. And I've been studying this really for about 14 years now, 10 years working as a nutrition researcher full time. And I could, out of all of the evidence I've looked at, it comes down to one reason that they can, from a medical standpoint, promote these as healthy, and it's because they lower cholesterol. And I often say, well, guess what? So does arsenic lower cholesterol, right? And in fact, many poisons are known to lower cholesterol, and that's exactly what vegetable oils are. They're chronic metabolic biological poisons, and they do indeed lower our cholesterol, and that is not a beneficial thing at all. We can get into the reasons why, but anyway, I in 2019 at Low Carb Denver, I went public with this, stating, that I'm going to differ with all of these organizations, and I've never looked back, and I'm happy that I went this route, because this is where the science has led me, Rena. It's just clear and plainly obvious to me that seed oils are dangerous and that they're maiming and killing us, and we need to get them out of our food supply.
You mentioned the vegetable seed oils. I want to talk a little bit about terminology a little bit later because we're going to mention a few names: omega-6, linoleic acid, vegetable oils. It's first good to understand how these vegetable oils, they are fatty acids. How on earth could they contribute towards chronic inflammation? Starting off with the heart and the brain, because that is what people are most concerned about. And usually we see the highest causes of death is heart attacks and cardiovascular disease. How do these fatty acids and oils cause heart disease?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Rena. So it's a very, very long answer, of course, but I can break it down into some parts and give you just the overall concepts. And in general, what I teach is that seed oils, when consumed, are pro-inflammatory, pro-oxidative, toxic, and nutrient deficient. So I call those the 4 pillars of hazard. And you put those together and you have the recipe for metabolic disaster. So if you're talking about cardiovascular disease in general, we can make it really, really simple. Here's basically what happens when we consume seed oils. They're high in omega-6 fat, and that omega-6 fat is taken up into LDL cholesterol. And because the omega-6s are unsaturated fatty acids, or they're really polyunsaturated fatty acids, they're highly prone to oxidation. And so the fatty acids in there then oxidize. And they're going to oxidize because they're exposed to free radicals all the time. We were making 1 times 10 to the 21st, I think it's hydroxyl radicals in our bodies in a day. It's just a staggeringly large number. So we're exposed to free radicals all the time. Anyway, so the LDL will oxidize, and you can measure that with the downstream metabolic byproducts of omega-6 linoleic acid breakdown or metabolism. And those are components like malondialdehyde or MDA, and 9 and 13 HODE, which is hydroxyoctadecadienoic acid. Nobody needs to know that, right? 9 and 13 HODE. But those 3 components then indicate the presence of those indicate the degree of oxidation of the LDL. Well, when LDL is oxidized, it's pulled out of the circulation, and rapidly so, because it's so incredibly dangerous to us. And what happens to it is it's pulled through the endothelium of our vasculature, and it's deposited into the intima layer beneath the endothelium of our arteries, and it begins an atheroma or an atherosclerotic plaque. And this is the plaques that people are worried about when they get coronary heart disease, right? And as that plaque, thickens, and then eventually it can rupture and clot, and there you have a heart attack. And there's similar mechanisms, which I won't go into, but similar mechanisms that can occur in stroke, for example. So later we can get into the metabolism of fatty acids and how long it takes us to get these out of our body and so forth, these seed oils essentially. And but the good news I want to tell you and your audience is that if you stop seed oils today, you will be healthier today. You will be healthier in hours, because you will drop the oxidation, and you will drop the inflammation, and you'll drop the toxicity within hours. So you can decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease today by stopping seed oils. Like you'd stop them today and tonight or tomorrow or whatever, you will have lower risk of cardiovascular events. In the brain, you mentioned there are similar reasons for damage to the brain. For example, I mentioned one of the pillars of hazard is toxicity, right? And it has been well documented that we accumulate 4-hydroxynonenal or 4-HNE, which is a downstream metabolic byproduct of seed oil metabolism. So again, linoleic acid, it gets broken down into all these toxic, downstream products, one of which is 4-HNE. And that's been shown to accumulate in the brains of people. And although it hasn't been as far as I know, it hasn't been directly correlated with Alzheimer's or dementia. But I think it's just because that work hasn't been done. However, it's been shown that people accumulate 4-HNE in their brain, and it goes up and up and up as they age. But interestingly, some people have very, very low levels, they know this, that are similar to a child's brain, like a 3 or 4-year-old. What does that mean? It means probably those are the people, I can't prove this, but those are probably the people that didn't consume seed oils. And so, yeah, so they probably have a much, much lower risk of dementia. There's a Japanese researcher, I think his name is Tetsumori Yamashima, if I remember right. And he has published a book and a scientific paper in this regard. And so, and he basically tells his readers and his audience that seed oils are destroying the brain, and it's because he as he puts it in his own words, it's like you're rusting inside. And it's rusting your brain. And that's really what it is, because oxidation is the same as rusting. So when metal rusts, it's oxidizing. And that's what's happening inside of us.
That was my question when you said earlier about the heart attacks and the strokes. When you say the LDL oxidizes, I was going to say, what does that mean in terms of oxidization? That means it rusts. So if you have that circulating around your bloodstream, causing plaque in the arteries, and that's what you see when you open up the arteries, in the arteries of the blood vessels around the heart, also in the brain, that's what you see. Question about cancer. How does vegetable seed oils contribute towards cancer?
Well, for all the very same reasons that I gave before, pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. If you look at, there's a whole lot of evidence. This is a very long story, but there's a whole lot of evidence in this regard. And I won't be able to give you very much of it, but I could tell you a few highlights. For example, in the United States, in 1811, 1 in 188 people died of cancer. They know this. And the best way to track cancer is cancer deaths, because cancer has been diagnosed by physicians for thousands of years. Literally clear back to Hippocrates' time, they knew about cancer. And in the last several hundred years, no physician would mistake cancer, end-stage cancer, really for almost any other disorder, like tuberculosis or consumption. And so the evidence is very strong that they at least could diagnose cancer in the end stage. Sure, they couldn't pick up an early, colon cancer or pancreatic cancer or whatever, but cancer deaths, they knew how to diagnose that. Anyway, so in the United States, 1 in 188 people died of cancer in 1811. By 1900, that was 1 in 17. So it increased from 0.5% approximately to 5.8%. By 1900. By 2010, cancer took the lives of almost 1 in 3 people in the United States. That was about 31.2%. So how did we go from 1 in 188 in 1811 to 1 in 17 in 1900 to 1 in 3 by 2010? Well, in 1811, we had no vegetable oils. We had virtually almost no processed food whatsoever. All there was sugar, and in very, very small amounts, but we didn't have refined flours. We didn't have refined sugar. We didn't have vegetable oils. We didn't have trans fats, right? And so as all those things entered the food supply and exploded, we became toxic, because of the vegetable oils and the high omega-6, and we became nutrient deficient, because that's what processed foods do. They leave us nutrient deficient. They're particularly deficient in vitamins A, D, and K2, which is incredibly important to cancer. And so if you look at the evidence, you see like there's a strong correlation with the vegetable oils. You don't have that with sugar, for example. Not nearly. The correlation is much weaker. For example, Clement Ip was a researcher, or is a researcher, that in the 1980s and 90s did a great deal of work on a consumption of vegetable oils and the development of cancer in rodents. And for example, what they did was he and his group they exposed rodents to a carcinogen, DMBA is what it is. So they gave them this carcinogen to induce mammary cancers, the equivalent of breast cancer in humans. And then they put them on different diets then. And the diets were exactly alike with the exception of one thing, and that was the amount of omega-6. So they varied the amount of seed oil in the diet. So it started at like 0.5% omega-6 linoleic acid, and it went up in increments, but it went all the way up to about 11 or 12%, as I recall. And so again, same diet, different only in omega-6, same exposure to the carcinogen DMBA. The cancers went up and up until you got to 4.4% omega-6 linoleic acid, and then it leveled off, and it didn't change much after that. And so this is repeated, and this was shown in different studies. So it's replicated. And what's so powerful about this is that almost all of the Western world now has omega-6 consumption above 4.4%. So when these researchers go out and they examine the population and they go, oh, well, there's no difference in people who have high and lower consumption of seed oils in terms of cancer risk. Sure, that's true, because they're all above 4.4% omega-6 linoleic acid. They're above the threshold, right? Do you see what I'm saying? And so, you know, it increases your risk to cancer only to the threshold. And then above that, you may be getting sicker in other ways. Maybe you have more risks of, you know, heart disease, stroke, dementia, macular degeneration, diabetes, on and on. But as far as your cancer risk, it levels off at this already high level of 4.4% omega-6 linoleic acid. So we're working on lots of other data in other countries, and we'll be publishing that data. But there's very, very strong data in United States, in Australia, I think it is, definitely in Japan, very strong data that's showing the link between seed oil consumption and cancer. We've had huge increases in cancer while the seed oils have gone up just in the last 50 years.
The presentation that you shared with me was absolutely incredible. I'm also going to link that in the Primal Lab. So if you go to the description of this video, you will see avoid seed oils. I think I'll label it like that. And there's going to be a blog post. It's called the Primal Labs. So Chris has sent me 53 slides. It's all the information there, the scientific evidence and everything that we're going to talk about in this presentation. So that's going to be available at the Primal Labs. I wanted to ask you, we spoke about heart attacks, strokes, Alzheimer's, dementia, the brain. You mentioned the diabetes. Something that maybe wasn't in that presentation is pertaining to hormones. A lot of people have insulin resistance, thyroid issues. Is there any evidence that vegetable seed oils can correlate with those issues?
So in general, what I would say is that if you develop something like Hashimoto's thyroiditis and you have an autoimmune disease, and in general, the autoimmune diseases, I believe they require leaky gut. And leaky gut occurs primarily in the face of is increased greatly in the face of processed foods. Again, the toxicity from those and the nutrient deficiency and whatever it is, those components in our food supply, like herbicides, pesticides, glyphosate, so on, that break down our gut lining and increase our intestinal permeability. So again, so-called leaky gut. And so sort of indirectly, seed oils are driving autoimmune disease in general, which would include something like Hashimoto's thyroiditis. We've looked at data, over, again, going clear back to the 19th century, and although they didn't have data then, the evidence is looks pretty sparse in terms of the prevalence of various autoimmune disorders. So, again, we've seen an explosion of autoimmunity in the last four decades. I mean, particularly since the data globally is not very good until you get to about 1990 forward. But you can see that there's been an explosion of interest in autoimmunity since the 1940s. And before that, the overall evidence, I would say, again, it's, this is kind of weak, but it doesn't look like autoimmune diseases in general were all that prevalent.
As Dr. Knobbe mentions, vegetable seed oils drive so many different chronic health conditions. We spoke about the correlation towards heart disease, dementia, diabetes, and even it drives autoimmune conditions. And later in the episode, we're going to talk about the healthy saturated fats that you need to eat in the framework of a low carbohydrate diet. Now, as you make this switch to increasing your healthy saturated fats and also lowering the carbs, you might experience some side effects like nausea, headache, and even low energy. Now, all this is extremely normal, especially at the beginning. And a very easy way to fix this is to add in some high quality salt. Salt your meals and salt your water. But if the symptoms still persist, I would highly recommend you use a high quality supplement that has sodium, potassium, and magnesium. This is so important for proper brain and body function. And that is why I have Element as a sponsor of today's video. I personally love to use a high quality supplement like Element because it has a science-backed mix of sodium, potassium, and magnesium without anything artificial and no preservatives. Now, Element has a wide variety of flavors to choose from, but I like the raw unflavored option every morning in my morning coffee. And my husband loves the chocolate salt and the watermelon salt. And right now, Element is offering this free sample pack on every order. So you're going to get 8 single servings of Element to try for free. So if you want this, just head to drinkelement.com/the Primal Podcast. The next part that people might be thinking is, well, Dr. Knobbe, Chris, sugar. I've heard that sugar and fructose is the evil, is the demon that causes metabolic damage. When it comes to sugar and fructose versus vegetable seed oils, in your opinion, which is worse?
There's no question that the seed oils are tremendously worse. And if I wanted to, I could make a strong argument that that sugar is nothing more than empty calories. And I think that's primarily what it really is. And I've been presenting on this since 2016 is the first time that I went public with our research that was back then was related only to processed foods and seed oils and age-related macular degeneration, AMD. But all that time I've been showing evidence that it's the seed oils that are the big driver with this, with almost all of these diseases, and not sugar. So if I could, I'm going to refer to some data here quickly that you could show a graph. But if we look at vegetable oil consumption, I want to just give your audience some of this evidence. So we've got data that we've published going clear back to the 1860s on seed oil consumption when it was actually zero. Almost globally, but there was no seed oil consumption at all in the United States in 1865. Through the end of the American Civil War, no seed oils. And so they entered the food supply after 1865. And then by 1909, we had increased to 9 grams a day. By 1960, I'll just give some numbers. We were at 19 grams a day. Then by 2010, 80 grams per person per day of total vegetable oil consumption. All right. 80 grams is 720 calories. That's 32% of U.S. caloric intake. And this is the amount of seed oils that reaches the person. So we have some plate losses there, and that's about it. In other words, that number is pretty close to what we're consuming. So you can safely say that Americans are consuming at least a fourth of their diet, if not some of them a third or more, from vegetable oils alone. So if you look at then, so sugar consumption, the sugar consumption was almost all of the increase has taken place took place before 1922. So we've not had a lot of, and I'm going to give you some data here in a moment. So I want to let me just mention obesity in relation to this. So obesity was 1.2% in American men age 18 to 80 in the late 19th century. So the last several decades of the 19th century. That has risen to 42.5% by 2018, obesity, right? So now get this. So the sugar consumption was already at 440 calories per person per day in the United States in 1935. 440 calories, all right? It had only increased 86 more calories by 2016. So that's not very much different, right? Yet obesity was about 3 or 4% in 1935, and it's 42.5% in 2018, right? So I hope you can see there's very little change. I'm going to give you, now let me just zero in on sugar consumption. Just between 1922 and 1987, sugar consumption changed from 473 to 497 calories. It's only 24 calories difference. That's a 65-year period, 1922 to 1987. Obesity rose during that period from 2.95% in 1922 to 18.6% in 1987. So sugar increased only 5%, but obesity went up 6.3-fold, again, from about 3% to 18.6%. But what did seed oils do? They increased from 78 calories per person per day in 1922 to 550 calories in 1987. So seed oils went up 605%. Again, let me summarize that. Between 1922 and 1987, sugars went up 5%, vegetable oils went up 605%, obesity increased 532%. So for people who look at this, who are saying, oh, no, it's the sugar. Well, how do they account for this? Sugar did not change in 65 years between 1922 and 1987, while obesity went up more than six-fold, right? But the vegetable oils went up more than sevenfold. More than sevenfold, right? So that's just some of the evidence. We could do the same thing for diabetes if you want to. I can give you the same. I can give you those statistics during that same time frame if you're interested.
Yeah, show us that, because I'll show these on the screen.
Okay, so if we look at diabetes again, just 1922 to 1987, diabetes in the United States 0.09%, less than 0.1%. That's about 1 in 1,000 people in 1922, increased to 2.6% by 1987. Sugar, again, that's the same period. Again, didn't change essentially, right? It's up 5%. That's basically, you can look at the graph; it's completely flat. But if we put the seed oils in there, well, again, we mentioned that data before. Seed oils increased from 78 calories to 550 calories. They went up. So let me give you the data again, just to put all this together. So between 1922 and 1987, diabetes in the United States increased from 0.09% to 2.6%. It went up 2,800%. Vegetable oils increased 605%. Sugar increased 5%. So sugar didn't change. Again, so for people who say, no, diabetes is a sugar disease, it's driven by sugar. How can you account for that with 65 years of data in the entire United States where sugar is basically almost completely flat? But the one thing that's going up all that time is seed oils. And there's nothing else that correlates, nothing. Carbohydrates, fat, saturated fat, GMOs, glyphosate, herbicides, pesticides, nothing has the correlation. I've looked at, all of these things and more, and there's nothing that has this consistent correlation with these disorders like vegetable oils do.
So it's very interesting data. So when I saw those slides, in terms of the sugar is not increasing, so it's kind of like flatlined, but then you have this huge increase in the omega sixes or the vegetable oils. But I don't want to take away the dangers and the poisons of fructose, the sugar in processed foods, because this is really what people are talking about. Ultra processed foods, high in sugar, high in omega sixes and the vegetable oils, they should be absolutely avoided. But you're highlighting that, hello guys, look at the vegetable oils, that it's so dangerous. And the thing is, it is everywhere. People cannot eat out without having vegetable oils. It is that dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, again, I view sugar as a nutrient deficient food. And so one of my heroes is Weston A. Price, and he connected, processed nutrient deficient foods back in the 1930s to dental decay, arthritis, cancers, and just degenerative disease and birth defects in general. And I don't doubt any of that at all. That is extraordinary research, and I live by that. It's my guiding light for all of the work that I do. And there's no question. I've been saying for 9 years now publicly that if you want to get healthier, you need to eliminate processed foods. And that basically, the processed foods are made up of refined sugar, refined flours, and vegetable oils. That's basically it. The trans fats that were and still are in processed food, they come from vegetable oils. So if you get rid of the vegetable oils, you get rid of the trans fats, at least the industrially produced trans fats. The ruminant trans fats are healthy. Those are, as you know, those are very good.
That would explain, when people do different diets per se, it could be paleo, keto, carnivore, but as long as they're focusing on the whole unprocessed foods, nutrient dense, whether they include some carbohydrates, some fruits, because I see in the comments that I eat fruits or I eat vegetables and I'm doing perfectly fine. Then you have a carnivore saying, well, I don't eat any of that and I'm perfectly fine. It sounds like what you're saying is the root cause is to focus on, again, whole unprocessed foods, nutrient density. I also wanted to ask you a question around how you got interested in all this, because your background is an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor, but you have a keen interest and you're an expert in vegetable oils and seed oils. Where did it all start?
Well, I guess first of all, we ophthalmologists we're physicians first. We're surgeons, and so I had the medical background, but for me, it really, I went down this path, Rena, because of my own suffering. And for me, that was primarily arthritis. And when I've told this story many times, I'll keep this super short, but when after suffering with arthritis for about 17 years, I went on sort of a partial paleo diet back in 2011, and I had dramatic improvement in my arthritis. And it was so intriguing to me, and I was just shocked and stunned because I'd gone to so many of my colleague physicians for help, and always received typical medicines and steroid injections and whatnot for over a period of 17 years, and yet I wasn't. No one had ever mentioned that to me that it could have anything to do with my diet. None of my colleagues. So when I learned from Lauren Cordain's work, the paleo diet, Paleo Answers, where I first started, and that's not really what guides my work today, but that's where I started. And it was just, I was astounded. It changed the course of my entire life. And so I'm very, very sensitive to people suffering from anything. And of course, I went into medicine because I care about people. But I left medicine. I left practice a decade ago now to pursue this because I knew I could hopefully reach millions of people with this message that that I knew if I stayed in practice, I would never be able to accomplish what I can accomplish working at this full time. And so we have reached millions of people, through presentations and podcasts like yours and so forth. But yeah, that's what guides me, and that's what gets me out of bed every morning is to share this knowledge and to continue to work at it. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I've learned a lot, and I think it's important for me to share what I do know. And I don't ever say anything. I don't go public with anything until I feel awfully confident that I'm right, or hopefully right.
I'm curious to know, you mentioned the arthritis that went away. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's been a long story with ups and downs. And for me, a lot of it turned out to be oxalates. Are you familiar with oxalates?
I did an interview with Sally Norton about oxalates. A big issue when it comes to inflammation, and even when people do a carnivore diet, they dump oxalates. It's incredible how that can cause inflammation and pain and suffering.
Yeah. Yeah. And without going into, going down that rabbit hole too much, but oxalates it's easy to overconsume oxalates in our world today. And it happened to me too, because we have the foods that are high in oxalates available year round, and they're touted as the superfoods. That's the name of Sally Norton's book, Toxic Superfoods. And so I'd been consuming like lots of potatoes, sweet potatoes, plantains, cinnamon, things that are very high in oxalates. And I'm consuming them year round. And so now I have developed an appreciation, again, out of my own suffering, for, the need to pay great attention to the seasonality of foods. If in history, no matter where you lived or what population you came from, what geographic area, there's seasonality to diets. And it doesn't matter if you're in, pretty much if you're in the Arctic North, or if you're in, Kenya and Tanzania, or the United States, there's a seasonality to the foods, and you just can't consume those foods year round. But now they're shipped from all over the place, and we can consume foods year round that can be dangerous in terms of something like oxalates.
There's so many things that we have to think about. It's multifaceted, and that's why it's such an honor to speak to people like you, like Sally, other people that have information about different things that we need to be aware about. Vegetable seed oils is one of them. I want to talk about what are these vegetable seed oils, because we've mentioned a little bit of terminology here, just so people can understand what they are and where it is in the hierarchy of polyunsaturated fat. So maybe we can start there, talk about what that is, the omega-3, the omega-6s.
Sure. So first of all, seed oils have a very complex and colorful history. They were, in general, there's been some vegetable oil consumption for thousands of years. I don't want to try to get into those details because it's just very, very complicated. But suffice it to say, and we've submitted a paper that will document that seed oil consumption up through 1865 globally was almost zero. And probably around 90 to 95% of the population had never consumed a seed oil. And then cottonseed oil was introduced in the United States, as I mentioned before, just after the American Civil War, so 1866 essentially. Now, Americans knew that it didn't make any sense to them to consume cottonseed oil. They knew that it had been used previously as machine oil and lamp oil. And then it was used as fertilizer. They didn't think of it as food. It'd be like giving us motor oil and saying, hey, you should eat this. And so they weren't buying it. But that really didn't deter the manufacturers. They decided just to begin to adulterate foods with it. So they started by essentially adulterating butter with it. That's what they called oleomargarine, which they eventually shortened to margarine. And that's how they initially introduced cottonseed oil, primarily in the food supply, was through oleomargarine. They also then began to adulterate olive oil with it in the 1870s. And in 1880, the French made complaint to the United States. They had received 550,000 barrels of what was supposed to be olive oil coming out of California. And they could tell by the taste it was not olive oil. It was adulterated with cottonseed oil. So it may have been like half cottonseed oil. And they, I think that ended their importing, that ended a lot of export from the United States of so-called olive oil to Europe for a long time. But anyway, so then, in 1909, soybean oil was introduced into the food supply. And then we got all the others: soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, peanut oils. Those are all the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils. These are the ones that I would tell people to avoid, like essentially like the plague. Of those, sesame and peanut would be the safest of that list I just gave. So there's other vegetable oils we can get into that are even safer. But these oils are very, very high in omega-6 fat. We wouldn't normally eat the things that they come from. For example, no one ate cotton seeds. Cotton seeds were a waste product of the cotton industry. And so they were throwing away all the cotton seeds. And that's where manufacturers saw an opportunity to crush, press, heat these seeds. And nowadays, what they go through a refining process that requires, chemical alkalinization, chemical bleaching, and chemical deodorization before they're ready to go into the bottle. So these, if for those people who have never done this, you can watch a video called Canola Oil, How It's Made. And that gives you a really, good look at how disgusting this process is. And they're promoting it because it's a promotional piece for canola oil, as if it's something good. But you can see that it looks like motor oil for a while until they clean it up. But anyway, in the process of that, these oils are highly oxidized. They're damaged and they would stink because they're rancid if it weren't for the deodorization process, which is the last step. And that step requires very high heat, which causes more oxidation of the oils. Well, that oxidation, I'm pointing this out, is really important because that's how you develop these toxic advanced lipid oxidation end products, or ALs. And those are components like 4-hydroxynonenal, malondialdehyde, carboxyaltopyrrole, acrolein, and there's hundreds of others, Rena, hundreds. And so they would just have chemical names. We don't know them by common names, but who knows how damaging those are. But I compare this when you heat omega-6 linoleic acid, essentially, and it breaks down, it's kind of like smoking a cigarette. As tobacco burns, it produces more than 6,000 chemicals, many of which are carcinogens, mutagens, and so on. Same way, when you heat oils, the omega-6, particularly the polyunsaturated oils, they break down into these toxic advanced lipid oxidation end products. And so we're eating those. And in restaurants, they have vats of these oils that they cook their French fries and chicken nuggets and chicken tenders, those kind of things in, and you get very, very high levels of these advanced lipid oxidation end products. And so these are collectively, those advanced lipid oxidation end products, just so we've covered it, they are collectively cytotoxic, genotoxic, mutagenic, carcinogenic, atherogenic, thrombogenic, obesogenic, and diabetogenic. They really couldn't get worse. I mean, that right there can account for a lot of the risk of all of the chronic diseases, everything from, coronary heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's, dementia, age-related macular degeneration, and autoimmune diseases. All of these are in part driven by the toxic end products of these oils.
I wanted to ask that question so that people could understand when you say the different terminology, what that means. But basically, the polyunsaturated fat, or the PUFAs, so you have an umbrella, and they are fatty acids. So they're known as polyunsaturated fatty acids. Very healthy for you. But we have the omega-3s and the omega-6s. Omega-3s, EPA, DHA, as well as the ALA, very, very heart healthy. But then you have omega-6s. This is the arm that we're talking about. Too high of a consumption of omega-6s, linoleic acid is the most common type of omega-6s. Just want to make that clear. And then the oils that you just said are very high in linoleic acid and omega-6s, so toxic that they can cause all of the diseases that you just mentioned. I wanted to ask, how are people consuming all these foods? Because they're not drinking canola oil. So how are they consuming high levels of omega-6s, linoleic acid, or vegetable oils?
I'm really glad you asked that, Rena, because that is the most critical thing to know. So many people will say, well, I'm not putting any vegetable oil in my food. And you don't need to get 80 grams a day, to get a third of your diet from vegetable oils. You won't even know it's there. And because they're this, they're sneaky, right? We don't really see the fat of vegetable oils in our food like you would see the fat on a steak, for example, the big fat, side of it, for example. The vegetable oils, they are in almost all processed foods. Any processed food that has an added fat, it's going to be a vegetable oil. It's going to be one of that long list I gave you. Typically, you're almost never going to see, or much more uncommonly, or even rarely, you're going to see butter, lard, and beef tallow. So the animal fats added into processed foods. It's almost always going to be a vegetable oil. So you get them there in all the processed foods, and then you're going to get them in all restaurant foods pretty much, and all fast foods. And this is what makes fast food so dangerous and so terrible for us. And this is why, eating in restaurant, and particularly fast food restaurants, regularly is associated with so much obesity and chronic disease, is because that these foods are cooked in these vegetable oils. So I think did I get off track here?
No, you didn't. No, it's fine, because it's so true that, and I'm very mindful of this, that any time that we eat out in a restaurant, and that's the tricky part, because how can you socialize and how can you eat out if they're just using vegetable oils and canola oils, because they don't know the difference? Is there advice that you could give to the audience about how to navigate this?
Yes. First of all, I would say the very, very best thing to do is just to prepare all your own food. If you want to be really safe, you need to prepare your own food. If you don't, then you do have to navigate the landmines out there everywhere, and it's not that easy. You have to be really careful in restaurants. And I do eat out, with my family, with my daughter, things like that. And but so in restaurants, I typically, we mostly eat like steak, and I try to be careful that I'm getting or sushi, for example, and but I try to be careful that I'm not getting anything that has vegetable oil. So you can always ask your waiter or waitress. I have many friends and colleagues who because of my work, mostly they go to the lengths of telling their waiter or waitress that they're allergic to vegetable oils. And that could be a good idea. There's one caveat here, though, is if you go to that length, that if you tell them that, the chef may go to lengths of like cooking your steak in aluminum foil. And I don't really know if that's going to be a good step for you. And you won't like the taste either. Probably they don't cook right.
What's the problem with aluminum foil?
Well, it's just that I mean, my concern is that you might get aluminum in the food when it's exposed to high heat and your meat is right on it. I don't know if that's a good scenario. I would be cautious about. I would be concerned, and I don't know. I don't know that there you can that I don't have any data to prove that, but I don't want my food cooked on aluminum. That's for sure.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the solutions. This is a fun game that I like to play. Let's list the fats and the oils: worse, not so bad, and really, really good. So you mentioned the worst before, but I want you to list them a little bit slowly. And again, this is going to be on the Primal Labs, the link of all the information of the resources of this episode. But just for the audience, those vegetable seed oils that are really, really, really bad and how much omega-6 is in them?
Okay. So the worst of the worst list would be soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, and rice bran. Those are the worst of the worst. Let me just give you the rest of the list, okay? Just real quick. So sesame and peanut oils, they're pretty high omega-6. I'm going to come back to the omega-6 numbers in a second. But they're pretty high in omega-6, but sesame and peanut oils don't require all the chemical applications and the heat to extract them that all those other oils do, essentially. So they're safer, and they have a safer record of use, of consumption, particularly in Asia. All right. So then you have so those are seed oils. All those I just gave. Those are all classified into the seed oil category. One of them's a bean. That's soybeans. All right. Then you have the fruit oils, and that would be olive oil and avocado oil primarily. And these are much, much better because they're much lower in omega-6, and they also don't require any processing. You can just squeeze them and get the oil. And so safer, but there's problems with olive oil and avocado oil because of adulteration and because of poor quality. So I don't trust most of those. So if you want to consume olive oil, you can get really good olive oil and it can be really safe, but you have to be sure you're getting authentic, fresh, well prepared, well packaged, dark bottle, all those kind of things kept in a cool place and consumed quickly, like within 4 to 6 weeks would be best. Then you have the tropical oils. This would be palm kernel, and coconut oils. And these oils are the lowest in omega-6. In fact, palm kernel oil and coconut oil, they're 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. They're almost exactly the same as beef, or healthfully, naturally raised chicken and pork and eggs. And, they're all down there around the 2% omega-6 linoleic acid level. Now I'm going to go back to the crummy category, the seed oils. And you said, what are the omega-6s there? So they run the gamut from about 20% omega-6 linoleic acid in canola oil up to a high of 78% in sunflower oil, I believe it is the highest one. It's either safflower or sunflower. They're both in the 70s. All right. And then soybean oil, which is the most consumed oil in the United States, is about 56% omega-6 linoleic acid. So again, think of this, these are not natural foods. Natural foods and naturally raised animals, not fed corn and soy, and there's detail here too, but animals raised properly like that and fed their natural diet, their fat will be about 2% omega-6 linoleic acid. Compare that to consuming soybean oil at 56% omega-6 linoleic acid. And that linoleic acid, by the way, that accumulates in our body and accumulates in our body fat. And it has a half-life of 600 to 680 days, which is about 2 years. So that means that if you stop all vegetable oils and all high omega-6 foods, which could also mean corn and soy fed chicken, corn and soy fed pork, and lots of nuts and seeds. If you have all those, you have very, very high omega-6, and you'll have very, very high omega-6 in your body fat, like typical Americans, which was 21.5% in 2008. That's how much omega-6 was in Americans' body fat in 2008. And by the way, it was 9.1% in 1959. It should be under 3%. Is where it should be. But anyway, if you get all the oils out of your diet, I just want to say this, that it will take you 3 years to get your omega-6 in your body down to a healthy natural level, which is under 3%. But you have to get the omega-6 out of your diet. I mean, the high omega-6.
So it's the dose that is the poison, because you said the high omega-6. That is so crazy that it takes a full 3 years to get all of these vegetable seed oils out of the body. You mentioned if you have vegetable seed oils plus nuts and seeds. Do you mean whole nuts and seeds like macadamias, pecans?
Well, the macadamia nuts are the only one that are low in omega-6. They're 2%. So they're the same as, butter or beef tallow or coconut oil. They're 2% omega-6. All the other nuts are higher. And, seeds are generally higher too. So quite high. And so that's, again, but if you think about it, no one could ever have consumed large amounts of nuts on an ancestral diet. I only know of one population that consumes high amounts of nuts, and that's the Ikung in East Africa, and they're consuming mongongo nuts, and they're just literally their population is virtually they're not a good example of an ancestrally living hunter-gatherer who is successful. They're literally starving, and their children have kwashiorkor, which is that extended belly, because they don't get enough protein to even keep their plasma in their blood. That's how low their protein consumption. So they're literally just starving. But the point is that, again, this is another situation of this seasonal eating. Like normally people could get nuts for a very short period of time of the year, typically, and most people would not have access to very many nuts, right? And now you can just consume 5 pounds of nuts a week if you want to, right? You just eat them as a staple, and it's very dangerous. And I've seen a number of people get very, very sick consuming high amounts of nuts.
I want to ask you about olive oil, because that is quite interesting. You mentioned on another podcast or just now, 4 out of 5 olive oil products are adulterated. So if it's kind of they're available in the supermarket, and that's where most people get their olive oils, do you think the whole marketing behind olive oil, drinking olive oil in salads everywhere, in any way, do you think that is a hype, or olive oil has been kind of a scam to get people to consume more when it's just dreadful for you, most of the stuff that's available?
Let me try to answer this, and you can tell me if I've gone off track. To me, I think, I should mention, olive oil on average is about 10% omega-6 linoleic acid, but it runs the gamut from about 3% up to 24%, I believe it is, or 27%, right in there. And there's been more than 800 olive oils tested to prove that they run that range. So you won't really know if you're getting an olive oil with 3 or 4 or 5% omega-6 linoleic acid, or if you're getting one that's 24%, right? So you don't know that, first of all. And then, but I would say that in general, if you know that your olive oil, you can trust the manufacturer, if you can go to the plantation and see that where they're produced, and that it's produced, and it was pressed yesterday in the bottle yesterday, and you can buy it today, and you are 100% confident that that's a true and authentic olive oil, I say go for it. If you like olive oil and you want to use it, I'd say it's going to be fine. I think for most people who've been consuming high omega-6 diets, they would be better off getting all oils out of their diet, all of them, including olive oil, and get your omega-6 down, then add them back in if you want to. But that's going to take 3 years.
You also said that if an oil comes from a plant, it is toxic.
Well, my friend Kate Shanahan, who's been working in this area for a couple of decades, she said many years ago, she said, let me see if I can remember how she put it. Nature doesn't make bad fats, factories do. That's the quote. Nature doesn't make bad fats, factories do. And I loved that quote so much that I used it in a presentation or two, because the oils that are in the plant, they're fine in the plant. So when you get oils out of soybeans, or you get oils out of wheat, or out of, anything that has any avocado or olives, all those fats are fine. Those are fine in the plant because they're protected in the plant, and they're in they're in a ratio that's appropriate. But when you start extracting oils and put them into a bottle, you have a completely different situation, a totally unnatural situation, where you can not only consume this toxic substance, but consume very, very high levels of omega-6 that are entirely unnatural and dangerous.
I think that's going to be quite interesting for the audience to comprehend and think about. Taking a oil out of a fruit where maybe the oil should be in the fruit and not be extracted and then processed and then consumed. But that goes to the question of what is the fats that we should eat. Dr. Knobbe, what is the fat that you eat every day?
Well, so I eat natural animal fats that are in my meat, whether that's beef. Most of it's beef or wild-caught fish. Most of that would be, for me, is salmon, wild-caught salmon. I do eat naturally raised chicken, so they're not corn and soy fed. And these are hard to come by. Those are, and some naturally raised pigs or pork. The only fat that we add to our foods is butter. I don't use anything except 100% grass-fed butter. I don't use olive oil. I don't actually even use coconut oil, although I would endorse, the use of coconut oil if you need lots of fat. It would be perfectly safe. But butter has the advantage that not only is it brilliantly safe, but it has vitamins A, D, and K2. The K2 would be in very, very small amounts, but there's enough of it there to supply your needs. And none of the oils have any fat-soluble vitamins A, D, or K2. They don't have any. Even the great oils, olive oil, coconut oil, palm kernel oil, none of them have vitamins A, D, and K2. Those are so critically important that we get those. That goes back to Weston A. Price's work way back in the 1930s. And we're still, people are ignoring that all the time.
I'm glad that you said that. There is an interesting information about C15, which is a type of fatty acid, a saturated fat, which is actually found in butter and other saturated fats, that is actually needed to reverse chronic disease. And the fact that we have reduced our saturated fat is so prevalent in society because we have so much chronic disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, inflammation, insulin resistance. We need to increase our saturated fat. I love butter. I had a t-shirt, butter is gold. I want to talk about the dose that is the poison because you alluded to it earlier, but let's make it very clear. How much omega-6s, because we do need omega-6s, linoleic acid in our diet, how much do we need?
That's a great question. So we need about, I think it's around 2 grams per person per day, is all we need. Actually, no, I take it back. It's less than that. It's probably about 1 to 1.5 grams per person per day. I can give you some numbers. We modeled the diet of Americans who were extremely healthy in the 19th century. I think we're among the world's healthiest people in the 19th century, like the mid, to late 19th century. And in 1865, we were consuming about 2.4 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid per person per day. 2.4 grams. It would have ranged from about 2.2 to 2.6 would probably be the primary range. If let's jump all the way to 2010, we're consuming 29 grams of omega-6 linoleic acid per person per day. So it was 1.1% of total calories in 1865. In 2010, 2008, it's 11.8% of our calories. It went up 11-fold, 1,000% increase in our omega-6 consumption in 145 years. That's what's happened and that's mostly because of seed oils.
Last question for you relating to cholesterol and vegetable seed oils. So, the argument is that vegetable seed oils are very healthy for you because they lower your bad cholesterol. Can we talk more about that and why saturated fat, butter, is so important for health and cholesterol?
Saturated fat will definitely on average is going to raise your cholesterol. But saturated fat and monounsaturated fats, because the saturated fats have no double bonds, and the monounsaturated fat only has one double bond. They are highly resistant to oxidation. And that's what makes them healthy. So we can consume saturated fat out the wazoo and still be incredibly healthy. It's proven, like the Maasai tribe of Kenya and Tanzania. The research by George, I just went blank on his name. In 1972, his research showed that the Maasai consumed about 66% of their diet as animal fat. That came from almost entirely milk. That's where they're getting almost all of their fat is milk, because their diet was primarily milk, meat, and blood of the cattle they herd, right? And so of that 66% animal fat, around 42 to 46% of that is saturated animal fat. So it's almost half of their diet was saturated fat, and yet they had virtually no heart disease. They had one possible silent MI in the entire group. They had 50 autopsies, and they did 350 EKGs on Maasai tribe members and warriors, and nobody had ever had a heart attack that was documented to cause them trouble. It's a very similar situation in Tokelau, the South Pacific island of Tokelau, back in the 1970s. Ian Pryor and colleagues studied them. Their diet was fish, starchy tubers, and fruit, basically. And coconut, huge coconut. Their diet, 50% saturated fat. It was 51% in the men, 49% in the women's, averaged 50% saturated fat. And yet they had zero heart disease, zero. So that's the highest saturated fat diet known in the world, is the Tokelauans. And they had no coronary heart disease known. They had no heart attacks. They had no diabetes. They had no obesity. So, again, saturated fat and monounsaturated fats, they're incredibly healthy. That's what we need to be eating. That's what needs to be in our diet.
I'm glad that you said that. We are a big proponent of saturated fat and healthy fats. And I think that the more that we can get the message out, the better our world is going to be in terms of prevention of disease. I mean, all this stuff that we're just hearing, even about vegetable oils, fructose as well plays a role. All the chemicals, plastics, all these different things that people have to think, oh my God, another thing I have to think about. But it's very, very simple. Cook at home, use butter. We love butter, and we're going to be very much better off. Again, all of the slides, there's 53 slides. We're going to show a few of them on this conversation, but they're all available at the Primal Labs link in the description. Dr. Knobbe, if people want to find and see you more, hear more from you, where can they find you?
Well, they can find a lot of presentations and podcasts I've done on YouTube, just like this one, and on podcasts in general. I work for Ancestral Health Foundation and Cure AMD Foundation. There's websites for those, ancestralhealthfoundation.org and cureamd.org. I also have a personal website that's a little bit more about me and my work, but it's Chris Knobbe. That's ChrisKnobbe, chrisknobbe.com. And we have Facebook and Instagram and all those kind of things as well. But also I might mention we have a book. I have a book available, The Ancestral Diet Revolution, came out 2023. And that will cover everything we've talked about and a whole lot more, of course. So people can pick that up wherever books are sold online.
I'm also going to link everything in the description, so don't you worry. Link, so everybody can find you, website, book, link to the slides, everything. Well, thank you so much for your time. Honestly, your work is absolutely incredible. When I was listening to you, it's so funny. My husband said, "Oh, let's eat out today." I was like, "No, I don't want to eat out. No, I don't want to. I have my grass-fed butter. I have my meat at home. I want to limit eating out, and I don't eat out that often, but I think more and more people need to save their dollars going outside, buy the quality food inside. So Chris, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Rena. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. Chris Knobbe. If you'd like to know more information about vegetable seed oils, as well as a slide presentation with 53 slides, simply go to the description of this video, look for how to avoid seed oils, click on the link, you'll see everything there, plus that link. You have to see all the information. It's incredible. Now, if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support what we're doing on the Health Podcast. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm on Instagram, also on X under the name of the Primal Podcast. Now, if you love this episode, you'll love another episode I did with Dr. Mark Brahanna. Dr. Brahanna is a functional dentist. We're talking about the oral microbiome. Now, what is happening in the mouth or the oral microbiome is closely connected to every single part of your body and chronic disease. Dr. Brahanna will discuss this close link, as well as the number one oral care routine that you need to implement every single day, and some common products that you're using every day that is actually destroying your oral microbiome. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.